Okay, so this image is simply a screen capture from that little video which I shot with my iPhone 13. And what are some things that I notice about this? I mean, the first thing that drew me to this image is this wonderful color vibration between the between the beach and the water. It goes from a very warm brownish color to, especially right in here, there was a real kind of greenish blue. And then that blue gets cooler and cooler as it goes toward the horizon. And you don't really see that as much in the photo. Another thing about the photo that I notice is, we have these 2 points here. And they're very similar in size, shape, and weight. And so I definitely want to kind of minimize the background one, push that back into the background. Another thing that I sort of decided early on was this slope here with all these diagonal lines that lead right into the rocks. I just felt like I wanted some opposing lines, and so to all this, vertical and slightly diagonal stuff, I just felt like I needed a visual stop up here. So as you'll see in the painting, I replaced that cliff with a large bush. First of all, the primary thought is the receding water, all of these little streaks of water as the water is heading back out off the beach. So that was my main idea. And then the other stuff, changing the shoreline, adding a bush, and pumping up the color, as you'll see, those were all additions that I made in my mind before I even started the painting. And that's really what we teach at Mastering Light is we teach that thought process, that starting with a clear idea and what kind of changes can you make to either simplify the scene or strengthen the basic concept. So let's see how that all played out. So I'm starting on a 9x12 panel, and you can see that I've toned that just a little bit the day before. It's now dry, and that way I can sketch on this with some, I think I'm using some fine charcoal here. I like sketching in charcoal a lot of the time, not always, but it's a nice way to kind of work out the drawing before you begin with the paint. And in this case I felt like, especially because it's a small painting, that the proportions would be fairly important. And so I really wanted to, get the drawing just the way I wanted it before I committed to working in paint. So I decided to start the painting using one of my darkest darks. In this case, I don't always start with the darkest dark, but I thought in this case that would help me better judge the value of the water. Figuring out that kind of mid-tone value of the water would be easier, in other words, placed next to a strong dark. So that's where I'm starting, just establishing reestablishing a little of the drawing. As you'll see, I change some of that throughout the painting. I'm always adjusting the drawing in the paint. That initial charcoal drawing is really just a starting point. It helps me establish the basic proportion, perspective, and placement of the largest masses within the canvas, but I often make some pretty major changes once I start painting. So I always look at that initial drawing as just that, an initial drawing, and it's my job to continue to refine the drawing throughout the painting. So here you can see I'm beginning to block in the lit planes, the top planes of those coastal rocks, and as I stated in the beginning, part of my idea for this painting was to push the color. As I quite often do, I like to take what Mother Nature is showing me and then, maybe turn up the volume 10% on the color. And so you'll see that here. In the photo, these rocks were very gray, not much color at all, and I've chosen to really warm them up. At the very end of the painting, you'll notice that I cool them down again, and I let just a little of this initial color, which is a little bit too warm, I let some of that show through, but I gray it down quite a bit near the end. Now I'm working on blocking in the water, and as I stated in the very beginning, a big part of the idea, which I observed on location, but that didn't show up in the photograph, is the color transition in that water. I remember it being very kind of greenish as it got near the shore, and it got really darker, bluer, and grayer toward the horizon line. That doesn't show up in the photo very well, but again, that's one of the things that we learn about working from photos. They're often lying to you about values. They're usually lying to you about values, and they're often lying to you about color somewhat as well. But it doesn't really matter to me that much because I'm working largely from memory as a starting point, and then I'm just carrying that over into my concept, my idea. And a big part of the idea was to really show this color transition throughout the water. So it doesn't really matter to me that much what the reference photo looked like, because I'm painting my idea or my concept. And that's a big part of the self-talk that we teach at Mastering Light. The better you can clarify your concept before you touch brush to canvas, the better chances you have of pulling off something great, something you can be proud of. At this stage, I'm going to add a little bit of the shadow color in the water. The light was coming down pretty steeply on these rocks, so there wasn't a very long cast shadow. But of course, there's a little bit of shadow there on the water, so I want to add that. All these little touches, these little bits of detail, help it to feel more three-dimensional. And all of the subtle little color changes, cast shadows, little divots in the rocks, It's a small painting and it doesn't need this much detail, but sometimes I like to add the detail, and if I feel that it's working, that it's really making it feel more three-dimensional, then I'll continue with that. I can always come back with a larger brush and sort of big brush it or re-block it in, and I do that quite often. If I get too much detail too early on, a lot of times I'll just big brush it, bring it back closer to the block-in stage, and start again. But in this case, I'm working with a small brush here, and I'm kind of liking the way it's turning out, so I'll just continue with that method for now. Okay, now here's a little time lapse. We're going to just speed this up a little bit and see what I'm doing here, adding a little bit of the white highlights, and then I come back in and I start adding a few more shadows, reworking the rocks, back and forth between the rocks and the water. And this just continuing to add depth and detail and really paying attention to my brush strokes at this point. The next step is to block in the sky, and you see I start with a fairly simple gradation. The colors I started with are not all that different than the water, but then I added a little bit of a orangish glow at the horizon line, and that is totally something I invented. It's not in the photograph. Again, that's just me pushing color. Since I've already got so much color in the rocks and the water, I felt like the sky could also use a little more color. Here you can see I'm trying to paint in the bank in the upper right corner, and it's definitely not working. I tried it. I thought I would give it a shot, see if I could pull it off, and it just kind of looks like something sort of nondescript. It's not very well defined. I just really didn't pull it off, and as you'll see later in the painting, I changed that to a giant bush instead. Next, I'm moving on to the beach, the water-soaked, wet, sandy beach. And this was, as we talked about in the beginning, a big part of the idea or the concept for this painting was this kind of blue-orange vibration, if you will, between the blue-green of the water and the orangish color on the beach. And so I wanted to really establish that, get that blocked in at this stage. And now we've got most of the canvas covered. And that's just always a really nice place to step back and just sort of reevaluate the entire painting to see what's working and what isn't. And again, one of the great things about working with oils is we have so much ability to push and pull, to work back and forth from light to dark, dark to light, or whatever's required. And now I'm taking my palette knife and I'm starting to add some of the white highlights that represent the receding water on the beach. And I start with a palette knife because it gives me a nice sharp-edged stroke. I can, lay down some thick paint where I want it. So often I will start with that. I like using the palette knife, especially in the water. For some reason it just adds a little something extra. But then I usually finish with the brush. It's a combination of knife and brush. I'm using a couple of different knives here and the small brush again. And at this stage, I'm finally deciding, you know what, that bank is just not working, and I just turn this into a large bush. And here's the finished painting. Again, it's just a small painting. It was a fun study. It had a little more detail than I usually employ in something this size, but I enjoyed it, and I hope you did too. Happy painting, and I'll see you in the next video.